Okay, we are online. Welcome to today's live video AMA. It's our 8th edition already. It has been an eventful month for Triall, so we hope to get you up to speed on everything that we've been doing. My name is Rimmel van der Waal. I'm Head of Strategic Partnerships at Triall, and I'm joined today by our CEO, Hadil Esbay, our CTO, Niels Klomp, and our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Arno Bisschop. Welcome, guys. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having us, mate.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Similar to our previous sessions, we will start with answering pre-submitted questions that have been submitted by the community over the past couple of days. And then if we have some time left, we will also answer live questions from the audience. So starting with the first question, there are many projects that have been ceased to exist when the market is down because they have no motivation or because they run out of capital. What is the motivation for Triall to be able to create breakthrough products even when the market is down? Arno, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ray, for the question. Well, I think it's very important to stress that healthcare and everything that comes along with the clinical community is not a nice to have. I mean, it's a need to have. So what you see is that when times are tough, that all types of investors or all sorts of investors, they move towards healthcare because it's in a way, it's kind of a safe haven. You also see that for a lot of people, it comes with a lot of purpose. So it's really a purposeful investment to put your time in or other resources. So I think that what you see is that when times are tough, people are moving towards healthcare and the clinical community instead of moving away from it.
Thanks, Arno. Clear answer. Another question that I have, I think I'm going to give this one to Hadil, is what is your long-term vision for the industry? And are you afraid that someday there will be another company with more innovative technology that replaces yours? So Hadil, perhaps you'd like to start with your or our long-term vision for the clinical trial industry, and then afterwards you can touch upon competitors and how we sort of relate ourselves to others.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. That's a really, really good question. So we see that the clinical trial landscape is really changing rapidly. Where we used to start at looking at a disease, we're now also focusing on preventing disease. So really focusing on the health rather than disease-driven. We are also seeing a lot of trends that tell us that we try to discover diseases and all kinds of innovative medicine rather early versus just try to treat the disease that we used to do. So the shift from late discovery and making sure that you mitigate a disease to really early discovery and preventing the disease. We also see that from a centralized way of running a clinical trial, we're moving to decentralized. And I think this is maybe something that I can maybe elaborate on a little further because it's directly in what Triall is all about. So where in the 80s and 90s, clinical trials really used to be centralized, meaning everything with and between a patient and an investigator used to take place at a physical location, a clinical trial site. We then see that in the late 90s and early 2000s, we invented all these so-called e-clinical applications. So this is basically software that helps to generate data for your clinical trial. So that can be an electronic questionnaire. It can be an electronic form to capture somebody's consent. It can be an application that allows so-called remote monitoring by different functionalities. And we now see that we really very recently are opening or enabling a so-called next wave of innovation based on Web3. And this, in our case, we think that blockchain is really an important enabler here to generate verifiable data, to help with implementing privacy-enhancing technologies, noting that the technologies on themselves are not new. It is just the way that we implement them in clinical trial that we feel and that we see is new. We also see self-sovereign identity as a very interesting way of creating digital identities on one hand, but also making sure that we develop function-related or role-related audit trails over time. And the end game for us is really about democratizing clinical research. So that means that providing equitable access to health, and by that we mean that giving people that generally don't have the same access to clinical trials or to innovations in medicine, bring them on board. And the data that they then generate, not necessarily from a site, but from a decentralized way, like their house or any other place that they would happen to be, through any device that they would like to use, the place where the data is generated, there we can also really talk about ownership of the data by that person, and eventually even think about how that could be monetized or used for all kinds of incentives. So I think that's what we see the industry moving towards to. And our role is basically that we just try to enable the new phase in clinical trial decentralization.
Thank you so much for the elaborate answer, Adil. I have another question that sort of relates to some of the comments that you made, and I will be happy to answer that one. Will Triall really seek to fully decentralize all institutions related to the clinical development of medicine? Well, that is sort of a multi-layered question, but if we would just look at the concept of decentralization, and again, this is something that Adil also already touches upon with the previous question, we can essentially look at clinical trials from different decentralization angles. So one is really clinical operations, being able to conduct clinical trials in a decentralized fashion where patients are able to participate from their home instead of having to travel to the hospital. So that's one of the angles, and that's really something that started already 20 years ago, as addressed by Adil just earlier. But there are other ways that we can also look at decentralization. Think, for instance, of data storage. Where is data being stored? Is that in a centralized cloud-based repository, or will we actually gradually move towards data federation? And I think the latter is probably true. Being able to actually leverage and analyze data, well, it remains in its original repository, will become increasingly important as we have data coming from a growing number of different modalities. So that also, for instance, includes electronic health records, clinical registries, etc. The sort of third angle that you can take, and I'm sure there are many more, is thinking about data ownership. So right now, still very centralized. Data is mostly owned by the clinical trial sponsor, and the patients don't really have ownership when you look at the clinical data that they are generating, and sometimes even generating with their own device. So I think we're really at the start of a power shift where patients can generate their own data using their own devices, and where they will also be able to own and then eventually monetize part of that data. So what's the role of Triall? Well, as Adil already mentioned, we are really the enabler in this sense. So we are enabling the software and the infrastructure that will allow these trends to evolve and gradually grow towards this 2030 vision that we have, where patients can own and monetize their own data. Jumping to the next question. And I'm gonna give this one to Neil since it's a little bit more of a technical question. Will Triall have any problems related to data storage? Blockchain is still a relatively new technology, so will you still rely on centralized data storage?
Yeah, good question. The answer is yes and no, and that's of course a bit of a vague answer. We are using blockchain technology, amongst others, for identity management, something that Adil already touched upon, for instance, for self-sovereign identity. So basically being able to express which certain party or person is doing a certain action, has access to certain data. And we're also using data to create proofs and to create audit trails of that data. What we're not using the blockchain technology itself for is actually storing all kinds of patient data, for instance, because as most of you probably are well aware, a blockchain is immutable, and you don't want to have immutable, personally identifiable information on a blockchain, which then is which you're not capable of removing or changing, basically. So the actual data is a mix of traditional storage. The existing storage solutions like cloud-based storage, like the document management systems like SharePoint, databases, of course, but also, of course, of new modern type of storage solutions, like, for instance, IPFS, so a decentralized storage. What we also see is that with the combination of the self-sovereign identity technology and the proofs that we are creating, it means that we can sort of make disparate systems compatible with each other, because they have their own implementations, they have their own storage solutions, they have their own users, authentication, etc. But we are using basically this common layer of blockchain technology to ensure that we can authenticate against each other and that we can provide the proofs, basically. And this also allows, of course, for concepts like data synchronization, and even more interesting, I guess, for concepts like having a single storage where you are basically able, a decentralized storage where you are able basically to allow certain parties to have access and to monetize that data if you want to. And of course, one of our important parts also in this data storage is that we want to be able to a certain extent, also have the patients being able to store their own data if they want to. Of course, it's not a requirement or not a necessity that they need to do it, but if they want to, that should definitely be possible in the future. And that brings in really interesting use cases, because that also means that as a patient, first of all, you are in full control of your own data, which is of course important. So with whom are you sharing it? To what extent? How long are you sharing it? For instance, with certain parties, where can they use that data for? Is that in line with the agreements that you've made or not? Parties should only be able to use your data to what you agreed upon, of course. But also interesting is that you wanted to, you could decide to monetize your own data instead of having external parties monetizing data about you. So right now we're still living in this world where the Googles of this world, the Facebooks, the social media of this world, and all kinds of other companies know an awful lot about you. We're not saying that that will go away soon, because that is a model in which they make an awful lot of money, of course. But with this new technology, it means that you can get in control of this data because you are owning that data, instead of having that in all kinds of different systems where you have no insight in what they are doing with your data. So to answer the actual question is, we don't have any problem right now in terms of scalability for storing this using blockchain technology, because we're not storing all the data on the blockchain. So it's a mix of traditional and new technologies like decentralized storage that we're using. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for the elaborate answer, Niels. I really like your comment about you using the blockchain really as a common interoperability layer. And I guess that's what it's all about in the end. So connecting different isolated parties and systems and being able to actually verify the integrity of data while doing so. Another question that I have, a bit more on the technical side. So I'm also going to give that one to you, if that's okay, Niels.
Sure.
This is something that we've already mentioned multiple times, but we might not have fully defined it before. The question is, what is self-sovereign identity technology? And does this technology use artificial intelligence?
Yeah. First of all, the answer to the second question is no, or it could be, but they're not technologies that go hand in hand per se, for instance. But to just answer the first question first, self-sovereign identity technology, it's hard to grasp at first, I guess, and the name also doesn't really help. Because what does self-sovereign identity actually mean? I think, and I've heard someone in the industry coin a better term for it, which was self-managed identity. I think that already explains it a bit more to most people. The important bit of self-sovereign identity technology is, of course, that you are in control about your identity. And although it's not a strict requirement, but what you see in most self-sovereign identity implementations is the concept of so-called verifiable credentials and decentralized identifiers being used. There could be other techniques being used that could also be named self-sovereign identity, but let's stick to the decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. So decentralized identifiers are identifiers that are fully in your control. And you can create them, you can update them, and it's to be clear, those decentralized identifiers don't contain any personally identifiable information. It's basically a combination of public and private keys and some other metadata, and just like you and your family has keys to your house, you have the keys basically to your own identifiers. The public parts, like for instance, I can just publish my house number on the internet, the street where I live, so that people know where I live. That doesn't automatically mean that people can actually enter my house, because they need to have my private key, my key to do that. That's what decentralized identifiers do. And that means that those identifiers are not living in a system or are not being generated by companies, for instance, they are generated by you. Then you have the concept of verifiable credentials, and verifiable credentials basically are claims and attributes that go hand in hand with those identifiers. And those claims and attributes are, for instance, the things that you might think of when talking about identity, like for instance, my first name, date of birth, where I live, but it could also be something like where do I work, what is my income, or it could even be something like, let's say, if I wanted to buy something on the internet, to get a digital receipt of what I wanted to buy, to get a digital receipt of the invoice, for instance, to provide information about where it needs to be sent, to have a person coming to my house that basically does a handover to me, and I want to know whether that person is really working for a certain organization, for instance. So basically the whole supply chain towards delivering it to me could be using those verifiable credentials about the persons doing the handovers, the organizations being involved, but also about the actual data or goods that are being handed over basically from one party to another party. So you have to take identity in a really broad concept. It can be an identity about anything, basically, not only persons. It could be my cat, it could be indeed products. And the important bit is that the data, those claims in verifiable credentials, they are not stored on a blockchain, because then you get the same problem as I mentioned before, that you don't want to have any personally identifiable information on a blockchain, because that would mean problems, because you cannot edit it or delete it. So where is the data then being stored? Those claims are basically being issued by the respective authority. So let's say, for instance, my address. If I wanted to have a credential stating that I live at a certain address in the Netherlands, then, for instance, the city where I live could be issuing that credential, but it could also be some other issues, like, for instance, my bank, because, of course, they've also done a know your customer process, so they are fairly certain that I am actually living in this address. And they issue those credentials, and then I am basically the holder, so the recipient of those credentials. And I can store those credentials in my wallet. I can store them in a cloud location of my choice, for instance. And that wallet could also be living on my mobile phone, for instance. Then you have the process of third parties, of course, wanting to know certain data about me for various reasons. So let's stick with the example that I gave, that I want to buy something online. Of course, they need to know where to send the actual goods. And of course, right now, what you do is you type in a form on the internet stating where you live and where you want to have the goods delivered. With verifiable credentials, it basically means that your wallet will ask you a question. Hey, this web shop wants to have your address information because they want to deliver the goods to you. Do you agree in sending this data? And then you just click yes. Of course, you will see what data is being sent to them. And the benefit of that is that the other party now knows that it's not data that is self-asserted or just typed in by you. No, it's data that's actually being created by, for instance, the city or the bank. So they can verify that data and they can trust that data, which is, of course, a really big gain for them. But also, you can basically bind that data to only that use case. So they can only use that data for this purchase and for sending me the goods, for instance. So if they would be using that data for other purposes, they would be in violations of what I would like that data to be used for. And this is a radical change, of course, in how you can trust data, because up until now, one of the key missing things on the internet is the lack of a real identity layer in the internet. So, of course, everyone knows on social media and also for instance, in Telegram, well, some people have their full name, like our team has. And our LinkedIn post, etc. So everyone knows that we are real. But then, of course, if I would be just using a nickname, nobody would know who I am. And I'm not saying that everyone and for every use case you should know everyone's names, but for adding trust to data, adding provenance to data, knowing when data is being created or manipulated and by whom, that's vital to have the identity associated. And that self-sovereign identity is basically used for all clinical trial participants. And with participants, I'm not only meaning patients, to be clear. So that's also employees. That could also extend to all kinds of other parties that are associated with clinical trials. And it can be used, first of all, to authenticate using disparate systems, to create those provenances, those proofs, those audit trails. But it can also be used, for instance, in supply chain solutions within clinical trials about when was a medicine being created, for instance, which parties were involved, how did that come to be, and lastly, the important bit of self-sovereign identity technologies in I mentioned the self-sovereign data storage already. For patients. So the credentials, they are attributes and they can be about anything. And that also means that when you as a patient enroll in a clinical trial, that basically all of the data being gathered there could be in your control. And again, that is not something that is a strict requirement or that everyone needs to do that, but certain data would be really nice if that would be in your control, in your possession, and you decide what to do with it. And that's what self-sovereign identity technology allows. And in turn, that self-sovereign identity technology uses blockchain technology for those so-called decentralized identifiers. Then I know this was a really long answer to the first question. Then the second question, and I can be brief about that one then. Does this technology use artificial intelligence? The answer is no. It doesn't need or doesn't use artificial intelligence. It doesn't exclude it as well. They are just completely different type of technology. So with artificial intelligence in clinical trials, you will be seeing artificial intelligence, and maybe at one point we will definitely want to have artificial intelligence in our solutions as well. So artificial intelligence, for instance, is really good at predicting things. If you have large data sets, you can use artificial intelligence to predict outcomes of data, and those are typically quite good results. But it does mean that you need to train that data first. So it's not like artificial intelligence sounds like this really scary thing, and some people think it's really scary, but it's not like a computer understands the whole world just like we do. No, you need to train an artificial intelligence in a certain area, basically. You need to provide it with lots of inputs, lots of sample data, and then for a specific purpose, it starts to understand that small piece of the world, you could say, I guess. And that's where artificial intelligence can come in clinical trials, but it's not necessarily something that is really related to self-sovereign identity. Sorry for the real long answer, by the way.
No problem. You definitely managed to break down the self-sovereign identity concepts. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So to sort of summarize that a little and also translate that to the clinical trial setting. So what does self-sovereign identity, what will it eventually lead to in clinical operations? And I think just touching upon some of the items that you just mentioned earlier, Niels, it's really about empowerment. So providing patients with true control and ownership over their digital identities and related data. Another thing that I heard was really the concept of privacy, being able to selectively disclose only that information that is truly necessary for a certain digital interaction or transaction. And then, of course, also the whole topic of tamper resistance, which you get with blockchain to enable these secure interactions between different individuals, companies, and systems. I'm going to jump to the next question, and I'm going to hand this one over to Hadil. You explain in your documentation that Triall's goal is to increase the efficiency of clinical trial operations. I find it interesting to ask then how much resources could be saved by employing Triall's technology. Have you performed these calculations? Well, perhaps it's good to approach this question from two different angles. One would really be the clinical solutions angle, and the other one would be the blockchain integration part. But Hadil, I'm gonna let you decide on.
Sure. So I think we always like to look at these things as our capabilities as per now, per today, right? And as per the progress that we make in the roadmap. I think the fact that we now have this so-called end-to-end e-clinical suite basically means that we have brought several essential solutions or products together all under one roof. So it is an integrated way of using all kinds of functions and programs that you need to manage and oversee and run a clinical trial. So I think the fact that we now have everything under one roof, namely the trial kit, that's how it's called, is already a big win, because it takes away the so-called isolated systems that not necessarily always are integrated well. And I've managed myself clinical trials for many years, so I'm always very sensitive to the pain that the clinical research professionals have if they have to work with 6, 7, 8 different isolated systems. There's just a lot of time that goes into that, and also a lot of mistakes can be made from that. Plus, you don't necessarily have the oversight if you still need to maintain your own old-fashioned Excel sheets or whatever tool on the side. So I think that's already an area where I think we are winning a lot of efficiency. The blockchain-enabled part is absolutely fascinating and exciting because we think that we can, gain even more in terms of efficiency. And in our collaboration with the Mayo Clinic that we've announced a few weeks ago, as part of that collaboration, we will be, writing and publishing a so-called methods paper, where we're at least sharing with everybody who is interested in that what the groundwork will be, or what the assumptions will be for where blockchain will add value in the clinical trial, at least in our collaboration with Mayo Clinic. So there's really not a lot of quantifiable data out there. Definitely no industry-wide perception of how much resource utilization blockchain can get you. We now, in the past few years, as we've been really diving into this, of course, and trying to make it our own, understand that blockchain itself, the technology, is really a way of detecting whether things happened or they didn't happen. And in the element of detection, you can then, of course, if you're for 100% certain that something has happened and that data is unchanged, then you no longer need to focus on that, right? You no longer need to monitor that, because you have this immutable proof that things have happened, or that a specific document was in place and that was not altered, etc., etc. So as part of the decentralized trend that we think is unstoppable, we need to rely on remote ways to manage and oversee clinical trials. So from that perspective, we're always talking about risks within clinical trials, because separate from the biological risk, does a medicine work? Yes or no? Do you get side effects? How can you be treated, etc., etc.? There's really a lot of operational risk that we try to take away. And we think blockchain can really help us to identify risks before we start a clinical trial, to make sure that we use the blockchain again as a detective measure, right? And through the use of blockchain, try to de-risk or bring some of those risks, lower some of those risks, right? And again, in our landmark collaboration with Mayo, we really hope to demonstrate and also show the community how much efficiency we gain from the different functions or the different roles in the clinical trial. So I think we have all the stepping stones or building blocks to definitely claim there will be some level of efficiency, but we're not so sure how much that will be or which main functions will be the winners out of this.
Thanks, Adil. Clear answer. I'm going to go to the last question for today. I'll be happy to answer that one. Due to recent change in management at Liquid Global, TRL was delisted from the crypto exchange. Investors are quite worried about this. How is the team advancing its efforts to increase the number of top-tier exchanges where TRL is listed and to raise the project's profile and brand recognition? Can you share your short and long-term marketing plans with us? Well, first of all, I'd just like to mention that we are actively pursuing a new centralized exchange listing. But in that pursuit, we are really aiming for a centralized exchange that can truly offer us trading volume. So we're not listing at an exchange just for listing, but we're listing at an exchange where we can truly grow our community, onboard new token holders, and create a healthy TRL token economy. As to the marketing, we continue our marketing efforts on both the clinical and the crypto front. And we really truly believe that our success on the clinical front, through high-profile partnerships, such as our partnership with Mayo Clinic, will impact our success on the crypto front. In parallel, we're also growing the number of speaking opportunities that we have. So just to give you an example, in the past month, we've been to Florida. Adil has done a roundtable at Barcelona, the World Vaccine Congress. I did a pitching competition in Dublin at SaaStock. Next week, we have a webinar on Monday, and on Tuesday, Arno will be hosting a talk at Clinical Trials Europe. So there's really a lot that we're doing to spread the word about trial, spread the word about our vision, onboard new customers, and also onboard strategic partners that can help further our vision and increase our brand recognition. And that has brought us to the end of this month's video AMA. Similar to last times, we will return by the end of this month, so the end of November, We hope that you learned some new insights today, and we'd like to thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for organizing and hosting this, Ray. And we really appreciate the ongoing support and attention from the community. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Take care.